This is Citations Needed with Nima Shirazi and Adam Johnson.
Welcome to Citations Needed, a podcast on the media, power, PR, and the history of bullshit. I am Nima Shirazi.
I'm Adam Johnson.
This is the premiere episode of Season 8 of Citations Needed. We are back from our end of summer break. Thank you all for joining us again. Of course, you can follow the show on Twitter at CitationsPod, Facebook, Citations Needed, and become a supporter of the show if you are so inclined. And we do hope that you are so inclined because we are 100% listener funded. We don't run ads or commercials. We have no corporate sponsors or anything like that. We are able to do the show because of the generosity and ongoing support of listeners like you.
Yeah, if you listen to the show and you like it, please do support it. If you've always thought about it but haven't done it and you're kind of sitting there and listening to it, reach for that wallet. Why don't you grease me off a Jackson, maybe a Lincoln, maybe a Benjamin? Let's get this done.
Citizens to aid police in new program, reported the Los Angeles Times back in 1975. Community policing, law enforcement returns to its roots, declared the Chicago Tribune in 1994. Obama calls for changes in policing after task force report, announced the New York Times in 2015.
Periodically throughout the decades, U.S. officials propose some type of quote-unquote police reform, usually after a period of widespread protests against ongoing racist police violence. Police, we're told, will improve their own performance in relationship with the public with a few tweaks: better training on use of force and equipment, upgrading technology like body cams and shooting simulators, and deeper integration into the so-called community.
But every time a new reform is introduced, it almost always serves as a justification for bigger police department budgets and fawning media coverage over police, painting the image of a scrappy force for public safety that just doesn't have the right training and resources. Meanwhile, levels of police harassment and police violence remain the same, and in many cases, even increase. Indeed, 2023 was the worst year for fatal police shootings in decades, despite, or perhaps because of, all of the post-Ferguson so-called reforms.
On today's show, we'll discuss the media-enabled phenomenon of how pro-police narratives, programs, and budget-bloating busywork are spun as so-called reform, how they are used to stem public anger and placate squishy politicians and nonprofits, and look at the decades-old practice of turning public opposition to and victimization from U.S. policing into an opportunity to enrich and expand the security state.
Later on the show, we'll be joined by Alec Karakatsanis, civil rights attorney and founder of Civil Rights Corps. He is the author of the Substack Alec's Propaganda newsletter, the book Usual Cruelty, The Complicity of Lawyers in the Criminal Injustice System, published by the New Press in 2019, and also the recent study, The Body Camera, The Language of Our Dreams, which was published in the Yale Journal of Law and Liberation.
Story of the police body camera is almost exactly the opposite of the story that we've been told. And what I found when I looked at it with my research assistants was something I think really profoundly important for understanding the whole context of reforms, not just to policing, but reforms to the whole punishment bureaucracy, and indeed reforms across a wide range of areas where a lot of the most powerful institutions in our society end up using their own ineffectiveness, their own corruption, their own violence as an excuse to get more resources and to actually increase their capacity to control people.
Now, as always, we are required by Illinois, New Jersey, and New York state law to say this is a spiritual successor to episode 132, The House Always Wins, How Every Crisis Narrative Enriches the Security and Carceral State, where we discussed how various crises always present pro-police, pro-carceral solutions. In this episode, we're going to discuss the way police themselves, when they're in a state of crisis, when there's a huge public outcry, anger, or lack of trust or credibility crisis within police, the solutions that are presented to the public by the media, by electeds, and by liberal groups is almost always to give the police more money and more power.
That's right. Resources, Adam. Resources.
Which over the decades, we will argue, has mostly, not exclusively, but mostly not solved any of the problems that they're ostensibly supposed to solve.
While the concept of so-called police reform as a generic objective goes back centuries, the modern practice of framing counterinsurgency strategies as reform really began in earnest in the mid-1960s and early 1970s, following widespread uprisings against racist policy and policing, and the visible, often brutal police repression that followed. So let's start with the Kerner Commission of 1967. Following the urban uprisings of the summer of 1967, President Lyndon Johnson assembled a commission to determine, quote, what can be done to prevent, end quote, what it deemed to be, quote unquote, riots. Now, as Stuart Schrader, Associate Research Professor of Africana Studies at Johns Hopkins and Director of the Chloe Center for the Critical Study of Racism, Immigration, and Colonialism, has written in his 2019 book, Badges Without Borders, quote, the commission offered recommendations to alleviate racial and economic inequality, urging a vast federal spending program on jobs, education, and housing to address the socioeconomic conditions underlying the political unrest. President Johnson spurned this proposal, but most of the subsidiary recommendations the Kerner Report delivered on how to transform policing were adopted. The way to assure security was to reform its technical apparatus, end quote.
President Johnson formalized these recommendations by signing into law the 1968 Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act. The law established the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, or the LEAA, which, among other things, earmarked $100 million to states for, quote, community crime control efforts, unquote, and $50 million for law enforcement agencies themselves. The $50 million figure included, quote, $15 million for riot control, unquote, according to the Brookings Institution. Around the same time, the Ford Foundation had been providing funding for some civil rights organizations, including the Urban League and Congress for Racial Equality. University of Cambridge researcher Sam Collings-Wells argued in his 2020 study that by the late 1960s, the Ford Foundation began to incorporate police reform initiatives after backlash from congressional opponents of the civil rights movement, such as Senators James Eastland and John McClellan. As part of the pivot, in 1970, the Ford Foundation established, quote, a police development fund of $30 million with the stated intention of funding police training, procedural reform, and, quote, community policing, unquote, and building trusts between police and people of color. So-called community policing was, and of course remains, extremely ill-defined, seeming to refer to the mere existence of cops interacting with civilians. The Police Development Fund would later become the Police Foundation, as Collings-Wells would go on to write, quote, the Police Foundation was designed as a catalyst for liberal police reform nationwide, pioneering measures to repair the relationship between the police and community. Liberal law and order appeared to offer Ford the best of both worlds, a way for philanthropic organizations to continue its work on civil rights, but in a way which appeared, quote unquote, tough on crime, end quote.
By the early 1970s, initiatives centered around community policing and diversity in policing programs began to crop up in cities such as Santa Cruz, California, and Cincinnati, Ohio. Many, if not all of them, receiving grants from police organizations like the Police Foundation and the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, again, the LEAA. The Cincinnati Police Department, for example, received multiple grants in the early 1970s, including a $2.3 million grant in 1973. That's approximately $16.2 million today. This from the Police Foundation, in order to launch, quote-unquote, team policing and inclusion initiatives. A July 1972 article in the Cincinnati Post announced this initiative with the headline, Brother in Blue, Racially Balanced Police Teams, Aim of Program. The article would say this, quote, Cincinnati City Council is expected to pass legislation Thursday accepting a $1.9 million grant for a community team policing program, including a provision that the city try to hire at least 31 blacks for the 61 new police jobs the project creates, end quote. The source of that grant, again, was the Police Foundation. Just a few years later, in December of 1975, in Southern California, Santa Ana Police Chief Raymond Davis introduced a similar program labeled, quote, community-oriented policing, end quote, cleverly abbreviated as COP, framing it as a potential solution to the problem of rising crime rates. On December 23, 1975, the LA Times ran a piece headlined, Citizens to Aid Police in New Program. The Times would report this, quote, officers who once spent the majority of their work hours in patrol cars will have time to meet citizens on a first-name basis as a result of a department reorganization which included the hiring of 88 additional officers, end quote. The article would continue, quote, Police Chief Raymond Davis said the program was prompted by the 1973-74 statistics, which showed that the city's 20% crime rate increase was the highest among major California cities and third highest in the nation. To reverse that trend, he said citizens are being asked to, quote, be suspicious, to call us, to do what they can to help us, end quote. Davis said he expects an increasing number of citizens to respond to the program as they develop more confidence in law enforcement through interaction with police, end quote.
The estimated price tag for the program's implementation was $2.8 million during the first year, approximately $16.3 million in today's dollars, and $2 million or $11.7 million in today's dollars for each subsequent year. Part of the funding was provided by the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, the LEAA, again created as part of the Johnson's crime bill as quote-unquote riot control. The LEAA had also funded similar programs in 6 other cities at that time, according to the wholly uncritical report. The so-called community policing approach would expand throughout the state of California. After visiting Santa Ana's police department in 1977, Governor Jerry Brown outlined a community policing concept called crime resistance, ostensibly created to reduce home burglaries. Now, make no mistake, Brown was fully committed to carceral solutions, stating while introducing the program that, quote, we're going to pass more laws and we're going to build more prisons, unquote. Just how successful were these team policing approaches at reducing crime and building trust between police and communities, whatever that means? Not very. The LEAA was found to have little verifiable impact on crime rates and had the effect of further militarizing the police as it gave police departments surplus military equipment, including helicopters, body armor, and armored vehicles. And a move that's basically unthinkable today, the LEAA was abolished in 1982, wasn't for moral reasons, but budgetary ones. One of LEA's successors, the Office of Justice Program, still exists today.
And the Police Foundation, now known as the National Policing Institute, was a key driver of the much criticized and heavily debunked broken windows policy that followed. In 1982, 2 Police Foundation officials, George L. Kelling and James Q. Wilson, authored an infamous piece headlined Broken Windows for the Atlantic Monthly magazine, a piece which we've discussed multiple times before on Citations Needed. Now, Kelling and Wilson introduced this theory as an extension of community policing, suggesting embedding officers in neighborhoods on quote-unquote foot patrol to crack down on quote-unquote disorderly behavior like loitering, asking for money, or so-called rowdiness in order to prevent more serious crime. Never mind, of course, that broken windows policies all across the United States has led inevitably to surveillance, racist targeting, and criminalization of urban neighborhoods, as well as the rise of mass incarceration.
Yeah, because one thing that I think really is worth noting here is that when you reframe pro-police initiatives in this kind of liberalese, you accomplish 2 things. Number one, of course, you increase the budgets of police departments and power and surveillance and militarization. But also you sort of look like you're doing liberal reforms because the sort of social solution, right, the kind of center-left liberal and left-wing solution to things like crime is that they are largely, not entirely, but largely social phenomenon with social solutions. Things like redistributions, reparations, building nice, clean, affordable housing and schools and universal health care, that these things would be a way of reducing crime, environmental pollution, putting, lead, which many criminologists have argued throughout the decades, increases crime. All these sort of, this robust or holistic approach to reducing crime gets totally pushed to the side or is completely under-resourced, if it's resourced at all. And then the solution becomes more cops in cages, but done through this kind of liberalese, because that's the easy, cheap solution that the ruling class prefers because it doesn't require them to redistribute their wealth.
Yeah, and optically, you get this idea of, more cops on the beat, this kind of liberal vision of every city becoming Mayberry, right? Like a town where, everyone knows everyone's name and you're all neighbors and you're all friendly. And the cop is just, one other neighbor, which obviously is not the reality in so many communities across this country. But this idea of community policing or more foot patrol or more cops on the beat has this veneer, right? It's a way to say, oh, cops are part of the social fabric just as much as anyone in the neighborhood. And this type of quote unquote reform, as we see, is very palatable, gets a lot of funding, and does very little to not only, say, reduce so-called rising crime rates, right, which the media is obsessed with, but really just masks the funneling of more and more money into police coffers.
Yeah, because at the time, from the 1960s when they started up until the mid 90s, for 25, 30 years, crime rates didn't go down. In many ways, they went up. But meanwhile, the mass incarceration skyrocketed around the same time. And so there was a sense that they could just you could just keep building cages and funding more police, and that would somehow solve the problem. Because again, the goal is to pivot away from social solutions that deal with the underlying causes. So here we are in the 90s. So let's start off in 1994 when Bill Clinton signed the Violent Crime and Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994, sponsored most notoriously by now President Joseph Robinette Biden. This is generically known as the Crime Bill. 2 years after he campaigned as a tough on crime candidate, the law was the largest federal crime legislation ever passed in the U.S., and of course is notorious for creating harsher criminal sentences and incentivizing states to build and fill more prisons even as crime rates were falling. The law contained a community policing provision characterizing, quote, community policing as, quote, cops on the beat, unquote, meaning more uniformed officers on the street, and thus adopting the broken windows framework. The law authorized the distribution of grants for the following, among much else: rehiring laid-off officers and hiring, training new ones, purchasing equipment, technology, and support systems, paying overtime. The law also established a community-oriented policing services office. Again, the acronym being COPS. They love to use that. They want to use it several times. This authorized the hiring of 100,000 more police officers to patrol the streets, with funding going only to cities that launched, quote, community policing programs. The COPS office states that it had appropriated more than $20 billion for so-called, quote, community policing initiative since its creation. The word community policing in the bill itself, in the crime bill itself, is used dozens of times.
Now, a few months before the bill became law, the Chicago Tribune excitedly broke down the stipulations for cities, stating under the headline, Community Policing, Law Enforcement Returns to Its Roots, this, quote, the 1995 federal budget has $285 million earmarked for community policing programs. The programs are intended to add more uniformed officers on the street, while working with schools and community organizations in educational and problem-solving projects, end quote. The Tribune would go on to frame broken windows policing policies as, quote-unquote, problem-solving. The paper stated this, quote, funds will be used to work with communities to identify and provide police services as needed, such as putting more police on foot patrols in problem neighborhoods, establishing neighborhood watch educational programs, setting up mini stations in high crime neighborhoods, bike patrols and or corner beats as needed, and adding drug and crime prevention programs in schools, end quote.
In the past 2 decades, we've had a torrent of so-called reforms, many of which, if not most of which, have involved a similar dynamic of just pumping money back into the police with very little redistribution of power or any concrete results at all. The most egregious example, and the one our guest wrote a whole study about, is that of body cameras. This became popular following the uprisings in August of 2014 in response to local police officer Darren Wilson shooting Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. The protests were, of course, met with a highly militarized police response involving machine guns, armored vehicles, and other military-grade equipment. Just a few months after the uprisings began in December of 2014, then President Barack Obama requested $263 million in police funding in order to, as NBC News put it, quote, help improve relations between police departments and minority communities, unquote, through such, quote unquote, reforms as, quote unquote, oversight, transparency, and training, unquote, for use of military grade weapons and equipment and the use of body cameras. This training would be a convenient way to avoid the act of reducing military surplus available to police while generating the appearance of being a vaguely progressive reform. So once again, police shoot someone, national uprising protest, and the result, $250 million more to police. And now here's a clip from NBC's Nightly News from December 1st of 2014, announcing Obama's proposal in a gleeful and hopeful way.
After a series of meetings today, the president promised programs to bring police and communities together.
Part of the reason this time will be different is because the President of the United States is deeply invested in making sure that this time is different.
The president is also asking for $263 million for community policing, including $75 million for body-worn cameras. A year-long test in California showed dramatic results. Far fewer complaints of police abuse, and use of force was way down.
Yes, dramatic results, Adam. Indeed, the California study that NBC cited in that clip, which is commonly known as the Rialto study, was deeply influential. Axon Enterprise, formerly known as Taser, which had sold more than 300,000 police cameras worldwide as of 2013, has cited this Rialto study on its own website. And as the New York Times noted, also in 2013, quote, a federal judge also cited the study in 2013 when she ordered the New York City Police Department to conduct a year-long pilot program using body cameras, end quote. It was similarly referenced in a testimony before the Obama administration's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, which justified Obama's request for $75 million in body camera funding, as referenced by NBC. But while the study was indeed influential, it was also grossly misleading at best. A 2017 study found that police wearing cameras used force and prompted civilian complaints at about the same rate as those who weren't wearing the cameras. The study included more than 2,000 officers. Meanwhile, the Rialto study involved a mere 54 officers. Additionally, a 2019 review of 70 available studies on the effects of body cameras on police behavior concluded that body cameras, quote, have not had statistically significant or consistent effects on most measures of officer and citizen behavior or citizens' views of police, end quote.
But this clearly doesn't matter. As the body cam industry is growing, Axon, the largest supplier, claims it made $1.5 billion in revenue in 2023, a 31% increase from the previous year, and shipped more than 100,000 units of its latest camera model in the second half of 2023 alone. Another busy workflow reform is that of police diversity. Now, from the onset, we'll say, look, all things being equal, police departments should be diverse. Why not? It's probably better than having 100% white guys with Punisher tattoos who vote for Trump. I mean, that just sort of intuitively makes sense. But broadly speaking, there's not a lot of evidence, and it doesn't really affect police harassment and police killings. But this is a very popular talking point pushed by everyone from President Obama to President Biden. This idea that a more diverse police force will somehow be better for oppressed communities who are over-policed and over-criminalized. And again, money is funneled to police departments ostensibly for the purposes of recruiting and training people of color in these communities so they can, quote unquote, represent the communities that they police. President Biden, when lobbying Congress for his $37 billion police bill, said one of his goals was to, quote, help police departments attract officers they need and hire more diverse officers from the communities they serve, unquote. But as Mustafa Ali Smith noted at the appeal in 2022, quote, in response to the murder of Michael Brown in 2014, a 2017 study by Indiana University Bloomington researchers looked at whether more black police officers were associated with a decrease in police-involved homicides of black people. They found that the results were mixed. In some cases, adding more black officers was actually linked to an increase in violent encounters towards black people. In other cases, adding an overwhelmingly large number of black police officers was linked to a decrease in encounters. Overall, for the vast majority of cities, simply increasing the percentage of black officers, this is the quote, within a quote, this is the researcher's quote. For the vast majority of cities, simply increasing the percentage of black officers is not an effective policy solution, unquote, the researchers wrote. So the study showed there was no real evidence that increasing the number of black officers led to a less racist police force. Now, of course, the reason for that is because they are a function of a system. It's not about the discrete moral choices of individuals by and large. And of course, LAPD, which has a very diverse police force, is also one of the more notoriously corrupt and violent. So studies on this are pretty mixed. There's no real evidence that it actually does anything. There's no evidence that even it necessarily makes it worse. So all things being equal, sure, why not? But this is another kind of superficially sounding solution that doesn't really change the status quo much at all.
Another one of these is so-called police training. So let's examine this a bit. The idea that police officers simply need more and better training to do their job more effectively and thereby be more engaged with the community and ostensibly less violent. Let's see how this actually works out. A common method of police, quote-unquote, training is the use of shooting simulators, something we have actually discussed on Citations Needed before. Another product conveniently offered by Axon Enterprises. Another method is the use of force scenario training, which basically teaches police de-escalation tactics. Now, for over a decade, police departments have sunk millions of dollars into these types of trainings, these simulators and these scenarios. Yet police violence, especially lethal police violence, has not decreased since these simulators have been introduced. According to the organization Mapping Police Violence, the number of people killed by police has risen every year since 2019. In 2023, police killed 1,352 people, rendering that year the deadliest for homicides committed by police in more than a decade. The same year, 2023, Vertra, a leading supplier of these shooting simulators, reported record annual revenue to the tune of $38 million. Now, Vertra offers a useful example of how this simulator training industry has used local media as part of its PR strategy. Now, we discussed this a bit when we did a patron-only news brief called The Split-Second Decision Trope, Why Every Media Outlet Does the Exact Same Puff Piece on Shooter Simulators. In 2018, industry consultant Ron Lapidus wrote a media guide for Vertra, focused on how these simulators can be used to, quote-unquote, educate the community. Lapidus quoted Ed Smith, range master and training officer for the O'Fallon Police Department in Missouri, in order to underscore the need to sell, quote-unquote, the community, on the idea that de-escalation is theoretically ideal, but typically unrealistic. Lapidus wrote this, quote, Smith is a firm believer in continually sharpening the knife by ensuring that officers go back on the street every day just a little bit sharper than they were the day before. To do that, he has built an officer training program around his city's Vertra simulator. He has shared the same scenarios with the public so that they can get an idea of those split-second decisions needed to stop a threat. Participants and viewers soon learn that taking control of a situation is not nearly as easy as it is in the movies, and that de-escalation, while preferable, may not always work. End quote.
Right. So there's three things going on here, and this stuff is just made in a lab for citations needed, because it is, these police shooting simulators are a way of just bloating budgets for police to rack up overtime. But B, they're explicitly based on internal marketing literature that they write when they're trying to sell them to police departments. They are public relations devices for bringing in journalists to kind of do these rigged scenarios where they have to blow someone away, because the simulator is rigged, right? It's not like a real simulation. It's just like one of those, rail video games where you have to shoot someone, basically. And they always put in and when they bring in the reporter, they give them the scenario where they have to blow someone away. That's why they say it's not like the movies, right? And then C, finally, the reason why they're so effective is because this idea that cops are going around shooting people because they failed their training is actually the inverse. They shoot people because that's exactly what they're trained to do. If the training is just to tell them to shoot people, that doesn't really work. And that is largely what the training tells them to do, as evidenced by the fact that when they do these police shooting simulator propaganda segments, the reporter in question, whoever it may be, or even when they, as you'll note, they bring in activists to do it as part of some sort of like faux empathy.
Like a gotcha, right?
Yeah. See how it is? So they have to shoot the guy with the knife to the woman, right? So these are all PR devices and budget bloating pretexts. These are not here to help some sweaty rookie cop learn how to de-escalate a situation when Cletus has a shotgun to his girlfriend's head.
Now, this is also the case with use of force scenario training, as kind of distinct from those shooter simulators. And these can be both high and low tech type trainings. It's really in this context that we have countless local and cable news segments, again, featuring these simulations and scenario training as innovative methods meant to refine and reinforce police decision making. Here's a particularly noxious example from Fox 10 Phoenix back in 2015. That addresses protests against racist police violence, but only for the purpose of getting an organizer, as we've discussed, to sympathize with police as he experiences use of force scenario training. Take a listen.
On right inside your belt loop there.
Jarrett Maupin gets his weapon. You might recognize him as a high-profile organizer in the minority community. Just last month, he led marches on Phoenix Police headquarters after an officer shot an unarmed man.
We want his badge. We want his gun. We want his job.
Today, he accepted an invitation to look at things from the other side, agreeing to go through a force-on-force training session with the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office. 3 scenarios where you have to decide to shoot or not shoot. Scenario 1 is a call about a man casing cars in a parking lot. Maupin approaches the man and starts asking questions.
What? Where you have your hand in your gun?
You're looking for your vehicle. What kind of car do you drive?
Where you have your hand in your gun?
What kind of car do you drive?
It's my car, man.
Maupin, the officer, is shot. It happens that fast.
At what time did you think that it was time for you to address the use of force that was given?
When he came to the back of the vehicle, and was hiding. You know, I could sense something was wrong.
Scenario 2, a call of 2 men fighting.
What's going on today, gentlemen?
What's wrong with you?
What's going on today, gentlemen?
What do you want?
What's happening here?
What's wrong with
Back
you?
up.
Huh? What are you doing, man? Hey,
he shouldn't approach me. He shouldn't approach me. He shouldn't approach me. He shouldn't approach me.
What happened in there?
Yeah.
What are you doing? You just shot him?
Hey, he rushed me.
Tell me why you shot.
Well, I've shot because he was within that zone. You know, I felt there was an imminent threat. I didn't necessarily see him armed, but he came clearly to do some harm to the officer, to my person.
And later in the same segment, the activist turned killer cop, I guess, Jarrett Maupin, says that he recognizes the need to comply with police now. He's been reformed. He's seen the light. And then the news anchors discuss Maupin's experience and add this coda.
At the time, I can think through this and I can figure this all out. No, it's boom. It's just there. Yeah. It's that fast.
I have a lot of respect for Maupin for going through that.
Yeah, I agree. I do too.
And agreeing to go through that and seeing it from the other side as well.
Do you think it changes the way he approaches these issues going forward?
He says he's going to go out into the community and say what he said at the very end there. You have to comply with what police officers tell you. Let everything sort out at the end, but just do what they tell you right then and sort things out afterwards.
Interesting.
So there's literally hundreds of these stories. They run them every month. You can Google it. We did a news brief on it. You can check it out on our Patreon. And I wrote about it for the Substack as well, where I documented. It's the oldest trope in the book. The general idea is that they didn't realize how the split-second decision worked. But of course, the scenario they're given
guarantees a violent response. Like there's
the things that actually, for the most part, have outraged communities, whether it's, kneeling on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes or, Michael Brown being unarmed. These things are not typically some split-second 24, trolley problem the cops has to do, and he makes the tough choice,
Incidentally, this happened in Maricopa County, where, according to the Police Scorecard organization, there have been more police shootings per arrest between 2013 and 2021 than 78% of other police departments across the country, and that county accounted for more killings by police per arrest than 94% of other police departments across the country.
So again, these are the reforms that are presented by centrist liberal politicians as the thing that's going to fix the problem. But as the data shows, especially in terms of fatal police shootings, the numbers have actually gone up since George Floyd and since Michael Brown. So they're not working. And there's a question as to why they're not working. And of course, when you just pump in billions of more dollars to police, you can call it training, you can call it community this, you can call it being your best friend and holding your hand all you want, or, treat them like they're social workers with guns. But ultimately, the function of the police remains exactly the same. And this is why police critics or abolitionists adjacent organizations have taken this resource model. Is that the question is, are you just giving police more resources? I mean, the idea that there's uprisings in Ferguson and Obama's response is to send $250 million to police departments is wonderful public relations.
And to take decommissioned tanks from Iraq and basically send them to Missouri.
Right. And this is the kind of PR spin we're dealing with here, that the House always wins. It doesn't matter what the problem is. Crime goes up, they need more money. Crime goes down, they need more money because their budget's been cut. They shoot some people and cause, riots and local and national unrest. They need more money because they need more training. They don't shoot anyone for a year, they get more money as a reward for not shooting. I mean, no matter what the fucking scenario is, it's heads I win, tails you lose, no matter what. And I think this is, of course, one of the things that frustrates people who want to see genuine results, who want to see these communities not be shot and terrorized to the extent to which they have. And thus far, these reforms have not done that. And in many ways, of course, they've done the exact opposite.
To discuss this more, namely the phenomenon of body camera reforms, we are now going to be joined by Alec Karakatsanis, civil rights attorney and founder of Civil Rights Corps. He is the author of the Substack Alec's Propaganda newsletter, the book Usual Cruelty, The Complicity of Lawyers in the Criminal Injustice System, and the recent study The Body Camera, The Language of Our Dreams, which was recently published in the Yale Journal of Law and Liberation. Alec will join us in just a moment. Stay with us. We are joined now by Alec Karakatsanis. Alec, thank you so much for joining us again on Citations Needed.
Thank you so much for having me back.
So I want to start off by talking about, though it's part of a much larger trend of pro-police, pro-incarceration policies being framed as reforms, a broader picture which we can get into later. I want to begin by the specific subject of your study, police body cams. I'm sure anyone who lived through 2014, 2015, the Ferguson uprisings, obviously uprisings in various cities throughout the country, they remember body cams kind of being this apparently common sense, modest reform that everyone could kind of get behind. The idea being is that if police know they're being monitored at all times, that they would therefore be more likely to abide by the law. This kind of seems intuitively true to, I think, a lot of people, even people of, good faith who want to quote unquote reform the police. But you sort of paint a different story, one that fits squarely within the milieu of our show, which is something more sinister or more PR driven, and maybe has an ulterior motive. So I want to sort of begin there, what the origins of the body camera as a mode of reform were, why it was so aggressively pushed by pro-police forces, even police unions, in the wake of the Michael Brown killing almost exactly 10 years ago, and what these sort of good faith efforts got wrong.
Story of the police body camera is almost exactly the opposite of the story that we've been told. And what I found when I looked at it with my research assistants was something I think really profoundly important for understanding the whole context of reforms, not just to policing, but reforms to the whole punishment bureaucracy, and indeed reforms across a wide range of areas where a lot of the most powerful institutions in our society end up using their own ineffectiveness, their own corruption, their own violence as an excuse to get more resources and to actually increase their capacity to control people. So I think it's really important to go before 2014, when the body camera narrative exploded in the wake of Michael Brown's killing by Darren Wilson, to maybe 5-6 years before that, when many, many people around the country had not even heard of the body camera. There was a small group of companies who were producing the technology and who saw it as a multi-billion-dollar-a-year industry. And there's a whole constellation of surveillance industry profiteers who are not just thinking about body cameras, but they're thinking about all kinds of other things like big databases, AI, algorithmic policing, what's called predictive policing, various types of software programs, and ongoing perpetual contracts that can be secured to manage and update these systems for sort of in perpetuity. Also the sort of data storage companies, Microsoft and Amazon, et cetera, who have the cloud storage, cloud computing contracts. Anyway, there's this whole industry, this whole ecosystem, and they started marketing the body camera to police leaders. And what's really, really interesting is if you look back at their own statements by police leaders, by prosecutors in particular, we'll get into hopefully a little bit later why this was such a profound boost to the power of prosecutors. But they started marketing the police body camera. And if you look at their own statements from prior to Michael Brown's killing, they bear almost no resemblance to what came after, in that they don't talk about reform at all. The origin of the body camera was actually about surveillance. And it was really pitched as doing 3 or 4 main things. One, to reduce the potential liability of police officers and city governments, because they were giving police a tool that they could control. They could turn on and off. They could sort of utilize and weaponize how it was released to the public, which is a really important thing we'll get into later when we talk about the PR. Really importantly, it was pitched as a tool of surveillance. So, for example, cops can attend protests. They can affix a little device to their chest. They can scan the crowd. And then when you later combine the body camera technology with things like facial recognition technology, AI, you can all of a sudden have a documentation and a record, not just of who all is going to which protests, but who is standing near whom, who's connected to who appears to be a leader, et cetera, who is really agitated, who is not agitated, et cetera. They also were pushed by police and prosecutors because the thought was that it would give them very powerful, kind of almost irrefutable evidence for very low-level criminal offenses that characterize the vast bulk of the millions and millions of arrests that happen every year. And one of the problems is that that police arrest so many people for so many low-level things. So, for example, about 4% of all police time in the U.S. is spent on what they call violent crime. Only 5% of all police arrests are for things the FBI classifies as serious violent crime. So the vast bulk of what police do is kind of the relentless, pervasive interference in the lives of very poor people. The plurality of arrests in the U.S. are things like driving on a suspended license, unpaid debt, trespassing by someone who typically is unhoused, drug possession, disorderly conduct. These kinds of cases kind of clog criminal courts. And prosecutors have trouble processing all of these low-level cases because there's so many of them. But they're very profitable, obviously, because whenever you get a conviction for someone, there's fines and fees that are then collected, and that money helps fund prosecutors, police, judges, etc. So everyone has an interest in this bureaucracy kind of churning as an assembly line. And so the theory for prosecutors and police was you can actually coerce more people into pleading guilty for these low-level offenses if you can collect video evidence of them committing crimes. So those were the kinds of things, surveillance and increased punishment. And obviously, if you reduce the leverage that criminal defendants have to take a case to jury trial, for example, you also can increase the punishment. You can give them more fees and fines, longer jail sentences, etc. So those were the kinds of things that all of these people were discussing. They had a big problem, though. They couldn't get government to put in the billions of dollars it would take to outfit every cop in the United States with a mobile surveillance camera that the cops control, plus the very expensive computing database storage software that would allow the police to process this data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a lot of data.
It's so much data. I mean, think about what would happen if there are hundreds of thousands of police recording tens of millions of interactions. That's a lot of data and very expensive. And so they had this problem, and they wanted them so badly that they were actually getting people like Steven Spielberg to donate to private police foundations for the purchase of body cameras for like the Los Angeles police. This is how badly they were getting private rich people to like pay for these gadgets for them because they wanted them.
He just really likes filmmaking, so in his defense.
That's right.
He just has an ideological commitment to filming, but go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, but I think it's very telling that in the sort of mythology that's been created about them in subsequent years, it's portrayed as this tool of accountability and reform, when it was actually something that they wanted for profit, surveillance, control, punishment, etc. And in the wake of Michael Brown's killing, where much was made in the public and in the news media, and even by Michael Brown's family, right? I mean, understandably, that the story of the police officer didn't match up, and there was no video. There was no street cameras. The cop wasn't wearing a body camera, and understandably, people wanted to know what happened. The proponents of body cameras, the policing industry, the surveillance companies, police chiefs all over the country, they were very savvy. They saw this as their opportunity, and they engaged in a remarkable public relations campaign, really spearheaded by Barack Obama and leaders in the Democratic Party who were very pro-prosecution all over the country, who seized on this immediately because it was a kind of quote-unquote reform that could be offered to the public that would make it look like they were doing something about police violence, but that would actually enable them to funnel hundreds of millions of dollars a year into the policing and surveillance industry. And that's why it became a powerful reform.
Yeah, Alec, I actually want to pull one of the many threads that you kind of laid out here. This idea that body cams really, rather than, as you said, being a tool of accountability and documentation, have really been shown to be a tool for police PR. And as you have noted, who controls the footage is a critical, central issue here that was largely overlooked in this entire debate, and especially during the rush to then, as you said, equip every police department, every police officer with their own personal body camera. As you yourself have written, quote, as public relations specialists understand, controlling the editing of videos and the precise moment of their release can be used to either foment or diffuse a potential scandal, end quote. So, Alec, please do kind of like dig in a little deeper on this one part of what you teased earlier, this idea of, yes, things may be recorded, but who is in control of that footage, and how can that be manipulated even further to be a tool of police PR?
This is such an important point. I want to say a few things. First, not only do the police control the footage, but the police create the footage. So the body camera, and the reason I think James Baldwin's quote that the camera is the language of our dreams is so important. It's because whoever controls the camera, whoever stands behind the camera, gets to decide what is captured in the film. And notice that, many of the most famous videos of police brutality and misconduct, the Rodney King video, the Eric Garner video, the George Floyd video, et cetera, I could go on and on. They were not filmed by police. They're so powerful because they're filmed by people who are able to capture what the police are doing in the shot. The body camera is affixed to the officer's chest. So not only is it designed to be quite chaotic, but it's outward looking from the police officer to the person. Also, by the way, police are trained now when they're on the body camera video to say in the background things like stop resisting, stop resisting. They're trained to create contemporaneous records that create confusion. So it's not a surprise that the federal government and others who have studied this have shown that body cameras actually do not reduce police violence at all. But once you even create this body camera video, the police are then in possession of the footage. And you could see with the example of like Laquan McDonald in Chicago, for example, the police just hid the video of this child's murder until Rahm Emanuel was reelected mayor, until a court ordered them to release the footage. So when police don't want the public to see footage, it's either lost or it's never recorded or it's often edited in very deceptive ways that are designed to prevent the virality of the video. Because a video going viral immediately when a killing happens versus a video not going viral, or there not being a video for weeks or months or even days, is the difference between hundreds of millions of people seeing it potentially and a few thousand people seeing it eventually. And this is the whole ballgame for many police departments. So they also, as we talk about in the article, police departments have huge social media teams, PR teams. There are over 50 employees, for example, in the Chicago Police Department doing PR. They've got people who edit the videos, and when they present them to the public, they sometimes put music on them. They have captions, they have narration, they have deceptive editing. And so it's like any filmmaker. When you control what's being filmed and how it's then edited and presented and when it's released, you get to control huge aspects of the public narrative. And that's another reason why police wanted the body camera.
Yeah, it's such a perfect distillation of what we mean when we say framing the narrative. Like, it literally is about what is in frame, what is out of frame, and how to manipulate what we see and what we hear.
I was just reading this exchange I had with the official Taser Twitter account back in April of 2015 about this. I criticized a YouTube promo video they had, saying they're basically selling it so police can control the narrative, and they got all mad. How can this promo highlighting the unfounded claim that's disproved by video be a negative? We don't see the truth. Anyway, they basically argued. They say in the video that they, quote, want police to tell their story. Sorry, that's an aside, but it's just funny that they were marketing it to police departments specifically to curate narratives, to say you control the information. This was around the time states were passing laws saying that the police basically had unilateral control over the video footage itself, and that it was subject to these kind of onerous discovery laws on the behalf of the public and journalists, that they sort of would not be able to just FOIA whatever they want. And obviously that depends, that's a state by state thing, but I just thought that was funny. I want to zoom out here a little bit and talk about this bigger trend here that we've been talking about on this episode, which is framing police bloating policies, increased surveillance, increased carceral policies as reforms, just as, one frames school privatization as school reform, or promotes Ross Perot, gutting the federal government as a reform party, right? Reform is kind of this great generic word. Obviously, this is one of the reasons why there was a pivot to more concrete demands like defund or abolish the police in the wake of George Floyd in 2020, because people had seen where quote unquote reform got you in 2014 and 2015, which is they can kind of be whatever you want it to be. But from the 1994 crime bill that focused a lot on quote unquote community policing to pushing for quote police training and post Michael Brown, there's always a framing of more police budgets, more power for police, more gizmos and gadgets for police as reform, which is interesting because it's kind of an implicit acknowledgement that people know that the police have too much power and control, or that they're too sort of capricious and violent. But then again, it sort of spins it because, they're not going to say we need more high tech kind of RoboCop stuff for the cops. That would not be very popular, especially in communities that Democrats are supposed to represent, like Black communities and people of color in general. So everything gets framed as this very kind of squishy reform without much specifics, which is why a lot of abolitionist groups and other kind of more grassroots groups, especially here in Chicago, for example, and I know other places, their framework is simple. Does this add money to the police? Does this add power to the police? And if the answer is yes, then they reject it. Obviously, there are nuances there, but that's kind of the general framework, which I think is a really interesting way to clarify it. I know critical resistance, this is their framework. I think it's actually a pretty good framework. I want to talk a bit about this approach to framing everything as reform and sort of very squishy, very liberal. What criteria do sort of you make the determination with an understanding that some reform is good? Not all reform is necessarily sinister, but do you use a similar kind of resource framework when you analyze these things?
I do. I think there's a couple of different ways to analyze reform. One I would call more substantive and one I would call procedural. So as the substantive evaluation of reform, I think that's the best framework I know, the resource framework. So, you ask yourself a question like, is this reform giving this institution or this bureaucracy more resources and power when it does bad things? And if so, then it's probably bad because it's probably going to be viewed as a reward, actually. I think police and prosecution bureaucracies view body cameras as a reward. And so it's the very opposite of any kind of accountability. They commit all this violence and do all this stuff that people don't like, and then they actually get rewarded with more money for more things that they want, right? And you can see that when police celebrate the addition of several tens of millions of dollars to their budgets so they can have better surveillance programs. They want total information awareness, right? They want every cop in the country having a mobile surveillance camera that creates videos they can then put into databases, and they can pay for algorithms to evaluate all that, and they can learn more information about whoever they want to learn information about. Keep in mind, the police only enforce some laws against some people some of the time. So all of the surveillance infrastructure, even though police are called law enforcement, which misleadingly gives the impression that they're enforcing all laws against all people at all times, it's very selective. You have to understand that police are the policing bureaucracy as a whole, leaving aside all the profiteering that the companies are doing, but the policing bureaucracy itself is designed to enforce some laws, sometimes in some places, against some people in ways that help people who have power in our society. And so if you live in a really unequal society like ours, the more resources you put into the police are going to be used by the people who control the police, i.e. the people in power, to perpetuate the inequalities that underlie our society. So I think one of the most fascinating things about this topic and what I write about, I think one of the most interesting parts of the study is how did it come to be that all of these liberals and progressives around the country, not radicals, but liberals and progressives, supported the greatest expansion of police surveillance in modern history? And how did it come to be that these companies and policing bureaucracies who could never have dreamed of getting billions of dollars in state funding for this convinced a lot of liberal politicians in a lot of different cities all over the country to spend all this money on this technology? Then how did it come to be that other liberal people, namely, and I write about some of these, the worst examples of this, professors at certain schools, leaders at certain nonprofit organizations, they have started appearing in virtually every news article about body cameras as quote unquote experts. And they were chosen as experts by the mainstream media precisely because of their pro body camera stance. And so let me give you an example. Like it would have been really different if in every New York Times article, every CNN piece, every NBC News article, every Washington Post story, if the people advocating for body cameras were the police themselves, or were the investors in the police surveillance industry. If those were the people promoting body cameras, many people in the general public might have been a little bit more skeptical. But precisely because most of these articles had like people who looked like academic experts or even civil liberties experts, right? I write about the same guy from the ACLU who starts popping up in all these news articles talking about how body cameras are a win-win for everyone. Now, keep in mind, he's doing that in the context of research that shows that body cameras do not reduce police violence. And yet, the average person reading these articles is thinking, oh, well, even the people that are supposed to be in charge of our privacy and our civil liberties and thinking about these hard questions that I don't have the time to think about, even those people support body cameras as a reform, so they can't be that bad. And so there's this whole industry, and this is not limited to policing. It's a tool of counterinsurgency generally. It's the kind of counterinsurgency that was really perfected by the French colonial governments in Algeria, Vietnam, and the British colonial governments in a number of places, and it was incorporated into U.S. Army counterinsurgency manuals throughout the Middle East conflicts. It's a very common tactic in modern colonial history to co-opt certain elite elements of the population that you're trying to control as validators of the tactics and strategies and technologies and surveillance systems and control that you are implementing in order to control people. They're much more effective when you have credible validators from within those communities that you're surveilling and controlling and monitoring and enacting violence on. And that's something we have to confront, because I do not think that the body camera explosion and the surveillance and profiteering explosion that went along with it would have been possible without the active complicity of many of the sort of liberal elite in academia and in nonprofits.
Yeah, in some ways you can sort of see it's, aside from, I think, the more sinister actors who were pushing this prior to that, in some ways it's kind of the perfect, something has to be done liberal solution, right? So you have all this popular outrage, you have uprisings, obviously CBS is burning, things of that nature, Baltimore. And so you sort of have to do something, right? And so people take signals, especially from at that point, the White House, the Obama White House, who came out in support of body cameras because it was kind of the ultimate, again, it was a win-win-win. It's sort of win for reformist liberals because they got to go to their donors and say, we changed this within a very specific, narrow framework, right? Sort of a partisan framework, a framework Democrats could get behind. It appeals to the kind of liberal ethos of transparency fixes all, right? So you don't really you don't need to confront power or even take power away from people in power, but you need to have better disclosure or transparency. It is a kind of a liberal ethos. And so in some ways you can understand how it fit into this do something liberalism, where it's you had to do something because everyone understood there was a problem. And this was kind of the perfect do something, especially because the police union supported it by and large, for some rare exceptions. So it's, I don't know, to me, it was kind of like this perfect storm of just easy, inoffensive, generic, liberal, looking busy reform.
It's actually more sinister than that because, and I write about this in much more depth in the article, but police and leadership and the police bureaucracy and the punishment bureaucracy more broadly wants to associate anything bad that happens with bad apples, with isolated people for example, Derek Chauvin, who killed George Floyd. If at all possible, they want to blame anything bad that happens, particularly anything bad that the public finds out about, on sort of one individual bad cop or one cop who made a bad decision in a bad moment. And body cameras actually focus public discussion on particular incidents and away from deeper questions like, why were the police in that neighborhood in the first place? What were they doing? Why is our society using armed government bureaucrats to deal with this particular situation, et cetera, et cetera? And I write in the article about all of the different deeper structural systemic questions that quote unquote reform like body cameras actually helps obscure, because it helps police set the narrative about particular incidents that they capture on video that they want released to the public, when they're actually pretty able to prevent body camera video from getting out into the public, at least quickly, in incidents they don't want this for. But it enables them to, even in the rare cases where what happens on the video is so unambiguously bad that the police have to acknowledge a mistake or an error or even worse, a crime, it enables them to focus on the facts of that particular incident and not on deeper questions that I think abolitionists want us talking about.
It's the rat in the maze. You very quickly learn what wall not to touch because you get electrocuted. And I think that in the event of mass uprisings, you have so many people kind of looking around for something to do. And then invariably the thing that, again, is supported by cops and supported by people who want to focus on this kind of bad apple narrative. And especially a lot of these kind of vaguely reform adjacent groups like the Marshall Project. Yeah, again, they're validators. They're kind of liberal validators. They say this is actually good. This is going to change. And then, the data comes in and actually the situation's much worse.
Yeah, I mean, these cameras, as you said, Alec, like have everything to do with focusing on individual incidents while deliberately kind of decontextualizing and avoiding any kind of systemic or structural analysis, right? I mean, the image begins when the cops decide it begins, right? Like that's when their story begins. There's nothing before that button is kind of clicked to record. And that, you know, as you've said, is absolutely deliberate and part of this kind of laundering of pro-police policy through liberal counterinsurgency. But kind of digging in a little deeper into this, how like body cams really broaden the kind of violence of broken windows policing, this focus on the low level. Can we talk a little bit about prosecutors in this scenario? You know, I think we hear a lot about police, we hear a lot about prisons, and there's this other P in the middle, the prosecutors, and especially at this time when there is a framing at the kind of highest level of presidential campaigning right now of the felon versus the prosecutor, right? And the cop is supposed to be the more trustworthy one, the, kind of pro-cop prosecutor at the top of the ticket, right? All about law and order. Let's kind of flip that. You know, Democrats, liberals are like reclaiming that mantle. Where do you see that being incredibly dangerous, and why are prosecutors such a kind of key component in maintaining this surveillance and kind of carceral system overload?
I think the question of prosecutors is a really important one to understand when you're thinking about body cameras. And I think that the first way of getting into that topic is to understand that when we say that we are concerned about police violence, about state violence generally, we are not just talking about quote unquote illegal violence. So body cameras are commonly thought of as like, are they depicting or not depicting like police misconduct? But that's missing the sort of the rest of the iceberg. Just below that sort of illegal tip. I mean, the sort of illegal police violence, while, you know, extremely pervasive and horrific, is just the tip of a much larger iceberg of state violence that is sort of lawful in a sense, right? And for example, the millions of arrests for the possession of the marijuana plant every year, right? So there's been more arrests in most years this century, more arrests for marijuana possession than all violent crime combined. And tens of millions of people have been separated from their children, have been put in a cage, have been brutalized in many ways for possession of the marijuana plant. That is all legal, right? There's also a huge swath of the rest of what police and prosecutors do, which is jailing people for things that all of the evidence shows our society could deal with much better without human caging. And yet, even though human caging is the cause of enormous misery and harm, you know, for example, every year a person is jailed, takes 2 years off their life, and the US jails people at such rates higher than other countries that the entire life expectancy of the entire United States is 1.8 years lower than it would be if we jailed people like other comparable countries. So we're all being killed. We're talking about hundreds of millions of life years. The vast bulk of that, of those hundreds of millions of life years lost for all people in the United States, is legal violence by police and prosecutors. Body cameras are the oil that greases this machine because it, as I mentioned earlier, it enables this assembly line to function. It enables police and prosecutors to process way more low-level arrests than they otherwise could have, and to secure longer sentences of incarceration and fines and fees, etc., by reducing the leverage that criminal defense lawyers have. So it actually enables prosecutors to prosecute more people by making the prosecution of people for low-level offenses, because, you know, now the body camera video actually captures a person on video without an attorney admitting to possessing the drug paraphernalia or admitting to trespassing on the property to sleep somewhere, right? All of the ways in which body cameras simplify prosecution are ways in which we're actually increasing the ability and power of the government to enact state violence for things that actually are social and public health and economic problems that our society has chosen to handle through punishment.
I want to ask you about the two other squishy concepts we asked you about earlier, because I want to broaden this out a little bit, which is the idea of community policing and police training as this very popular solution. This is something that Biden, Harris, others who sort of nominally gesture towards reform, they always tried out those two concepts, community policing and police training. Now, I will give you and anyone else $100 if you can tell me what the fuck community policing is, because when seeking a fixed definition, it's very difficult to come by. And of course, police training is just this, again, a budget bloating catch-all that operates under the kind of bad apples liberal framework, right? The issue is that they're just not trained well. And of course, when you look at how they're actually trained, they're trained to shoot people. So the issue is not training. That's what they're trained to do. The issue is, that they did it, in a sort of tacky way. So talk first, if you could, about community policing, how you sort of see that term, how it's been still popular after 30 years, 40 years even, and how you view its partner in reform, police training.
So community policing, it's funny that you say that, because I have a similar thing. Whenever I hear someone in any space, whether it's a politician I'm talking to or a nonprofit person or anybody, and they say the word community policing, I ask them to tell me what it means. Because almost nobody in DC in politics, and almost nobody in any city that I go to where I litigate these cases against police prosecutors and judges, talk to city council people, talk to mayor offices, etc. Almost nobody understands what that term means. And very few of these people actually have any conception at all of the history of that concept. Community policing is a counterinsurgency tactic. Community policing is, and this is funny because a couple of years ago there was a scandal where Harvard had a ex-military professor who started offering a class on counterinsurgency where the students were going to help local police in Massachusetts adopt strategies from Iraq and Afghanistan in the US military and apply them in black communities in Massachusetts. And when the Harvard students kind of found out about this course offering, they started protesting and the university canceled the course. That was community policing. That is what community policing is. It's a term that describes a series of tactics that are designed to get a heavily targeted and heavily policed community to have nicer, warmer thoughts about the police, to embrace surveillance, to turn some members of a marginalized group against each other for the benefit of policing. So that's one of the key community policing strategies and tactics is police hosting basketball tournaments for, inner city youth, or police around Thanksgiving driving into a low income neighborhood and setting up a truck and giving away food. A lot of this stuff is done to cultivate informants, to boost falsely the impression in these communities that the police both care about their material well-being and are a main way that the government is actually helping these communities, as opposed to, opening food cooperatives and urban farms and grocery stores in these communities, right?
It also doesn't help that in every mob movie, this is what the mob boss does too, by the way. That's not a good sign when you're just doing what the guy with the white coat in Godfather Part 2 does.
Yeah, and for Democratic politicians, community policing is just a word they can say that makes low information liberals think that something different is being done. Sounds great.
Yeah, because community, I guess they're doing barbecues, they're doing little, face tattoo stickers and henna tattoos, and they're, doing the Super Bowl pool. I don't know, community policing. I know, it sounds good though, doesn't it?
And police training is similar. It's two words that, when put together, makes one think good things. Oh, the police are getting trained. Now, anybody who actually knows anything about the police training industry is horrified when they hear those two words together in response to incidents of police violence, because the police training industry is one of the most disturbing, violent, fascist, and honestly kind of incompetent areas of our society. It is where police learn how to be warriors, how to be violent, how to break the law, how to cover up their tracks. There's so many really powerful investigations by even state and local governments into the police training industry. Obviously, it's become relatively well known now that a lot of US police are trained by the Israeli military. And so I don't think we have time to get into the whole scandal of police training. There's some great documentaries and great research done about it. But the point is, this is a very nefarious industry. And it's kind of shocking and should be really scandalous that one of the main liberal responses to police incompetence and violence over the last 15 years has been to funnel hundreds of millions of dollars into one of the most violent and unaccountable areas of our society, which is training police in how to be more military-like warriors. And it's just anybody who proposes increased police training in response to police violence or incompetence is either an extremely nefarious actor who is trying to mislead you or completely and utterly incompetent.
Alec, this has been so great to talk to you. I feel like we could just keep going and going. But before we let you go, would love to hear about your forthcoming book, Propaganda: How Police and the Media Manipulate Our News. It is, as one might imagine if they're listening to this show, extremely our shit. Please tell our listeners about the book and about what else you have going on and where people can find your amazing work.
Absolutely. Well, it has been called by my grandmother the most anticipated book of the year.
There you go.
And so she's very excited about it.
Can't argue with that.
Exactly. She knows what she's talking about.
Yeah.
I've been, as you guys both know, I've been thinking a lot and writing a lot over the last couple of years about the very particular kind of propaganda that we all call propaganda that I think has really three main functions that I try to explore in the book using lots of examples. I try to also infuse the book with humor and funny anecdotes and things like that, because it's kind of a very depressing topic when you actually start to look at the sheer scope and relentlessness of the propaganda that organizations like the New York Times and most mainstream news entities are pummeling us with. And I try to give people some tools to fortify their own minds against this relentless propaganda. And I think it has three main functions, really. Function number one is that propaganda in mainstream US news tries to narrow our conception of what safety means. It tries to make us think that our safety is intimately connected with and maybe coextensive with the kinds of very particular crimes that the police focus on that are committed by poor people. So, for example, shoplifting. There's a lot of news articles about shoplifting. And there's whole sort of moral panics that are created to make us really, really worry about shoplifting. But shoplifting is a drop in the bucket compared to something like wage theft, which takes about $50 billion a year from low-wage workers in the United States. It's a tiny speck on the drop in the bucket when compared to something like tax evasion, which is about $1 trillion a year, or corporate fraud, $800 billion a year. So even if you're just going to look at property crime, the scope of the harm in our society dwarfs the narrow kinds of things that the news focuses on as crime. And so the first major function of propaganda is narrowing that focus. So you think about all of the types of things that harm us the most, like air pollution kills over 100,000 people in the United States every single year. That's 4 to 5 times the number of homicides combined in the United States. Water pollution, hundreds of thousands of people getting the most serious illnesses imaginable, death, cancer, rotting teeth for children, etc. There's hundreds of thousands of water pollution violations. You never see on the local news every night the same kind of relentless coverage of those harms, because the first function of propaganda is, again, narrowing our conception of harm and threat and safety to only those things that strangers who are poor do to us. Second major function of propaganda is through the volume of news and through the framing of stories and through choosing which stories get told and which ones get ignored, constantly making us think that those small categories of crime committed by the poor are ever increasing. That's why for the last 25 years, if you look at like the Gallup polls on crime, everyone always thinks every year that crime is up, even though crime has been down almost every single year in that period. And then I think the third and most important major function of propaganda that I try to really get at in the book is it tries to narrow our conception of solutions to these problems that the media has made us really afraid of. And it wants us to think that the solution to all of our fears about our own safety is investing more in the punishment bureaucracy and the corporations that profit from it, as opposed to what the evidence says, which is investment in reducing inequality, early childhood education, housing, income for people, the arts, music, theater, poetry, dance, athletics for children, reducing isolation in our society, environmental cleanup. All of these things are far more associated with what the police call crime. And so propaganda, though, wants us to think that if you care about violent crime or people harming each other, you have to support increases to the size and power of the punishment bureaucracy. And I think that's not only false, but quite dangerous in a time of rising authoritarianism.
Yeah. Sounds like that's going to be a good book. It's always such a pleasure talking to you, Alec. Your work is really vital. We, of course, have been speaking with Alec Karakatsanis, civil rights attorney and founder of Civil Rights Corps. He's the author of the essential Substack, Alec's Propaganda newsletter, also the author of the book Usual Cruelty, The Complicity of Lawyers in the Criminal Injustice System, which was published in 2019 by the New Press, author of the new study, The Body Camera, The Language of Our Dreams, published by the Yale Journal of Law and Liberation, and of course, author of the highly anticipated and grandma-endorsed book, Propaganda, How Police and the Media Manipulate Our News, which will be released early next year, also by the New Press. Alec, thank you again for joining us on Citations Needed.
Thank you all so much.
Yeah, I think this is why the resource model, while not perfect and can be a little bit of a blunt instrument, I think is the right way to approach this issue, which is, are you just giving more money, more power, more surveillance? Or are you building alternative systems of, not to sound, again, like a hippie, but of care? Are we being redistributive? Are we building schools? Are we building parks? Are we creating healthcare for people, both, postnatal, prenatal, maternal care? Are we building systems of giving people support so they can thrive and live? Or are we just giving more money to cops?
Yeah, exactly. The idea of kind of social determinants of health, as it is often known in kind of nonprofitese. But yeah, I mean, really just meaning the fundamental building blocks of a functioning society, rather than using all of that money, all of those budgets, all of the resources being allocated instead to these already violent wealth and property protecting police departments that are not and will never be integrated into the community in that kind of quote unquote community policing ideal, right? The idea that, the cop on the beat is just your buddy and you're looking out for him just like he's looking out for you and your family, right? Rather, what we see is more and more money just funneled into these so-called training programs or to new technologies, going to these businesses that are making plenty of money doing PR effectively for police departments. So the corporations are getting money, the police departments are getting money, and politicians get to have supported something, Adam. I think that's another aspect of this, something that we've discussed a lot on this show, the idea of having to do something without doing the thing that is actually necessary because of the way that challenges power or the way that advocating for maybe taking money away from police departments would be politically unpopular for some politicians, maybe most politicians, and therefore that is unpalatable. That is not what they can do, but they still need to, quote unquote, look serious, be concerned, wring their hands, and do something. And that something winds up being more money for police departments and the tech companies and the training companies that equip them and provide ongoing resources, bloating police budgets, but of course, still doing nothing for the actual quote unquote community.
Yeah, because ultimately 40% of the country is liberal and they need to have things that sound good, and that reform sounds good. So you just sort of pitch the same things that bloat budgets and provide military equipment and more power and more surveillance. But you can't make it sound evil, so you make it sound good. And reform's good, right? It sort of means whatever you want it to mean. And so it mostly works.
Even though it doesn't. And so that will do it for this Season 8 opener of Citations Needed. Thank you all for listening. Of course, you can follow the show on Twitter at CitationsPod, Facebook, Citations Needed, and become a supporter of the show through patreon.com/Citations Needed podcast. All your support through Patreon is so incredibly appreciated, as we are 100% listener funded. And as always, a very special shout out goes to our critic level supporters on Patreon. They include Brad Hayward, Zach Cathcart, Lorenzo Mitchell, Ben Lazar, Morgan Green Hopkins, Ed Zitron, Corporate Zombie, Eric Joyner, Buzz Among Us, Stinky Pete, DL Singfield, JM Geralt, Chris Vincent, Nigel Kirby, Scott Roth, Porter Shutt, Zachary Henson, Josh Durlam, Joe Wengert, Steely Dan Halen, Douglas, Danger Manley, Green New Neil, Trasdat, Brickshop Audio, Supple Old Man, David McMurray, MSP, William Rush, Garrett Geisler, Political Zombie, Extra Domum, Gwendolyn, Kyle, Heather Redacted, Kevin Bowman, Anna Marie Kane, Akash Rathi, Sivapalan Chovanathalan, Jason Eason, Chris Sarah, Dash X, James Michaela, Greg Westney, Drew Johnson, Max Belanger, David Bettner, Brendan O'Connor, Ultra Miraculous, Zappo, Sturm Wyvern, Darren Brady, Bart DeCourcy, Rob, Max Wilsey, Blake Bunell, Xenia Zedvornik, Tatiana Maslani, Tsukimi Yuki, Psychic Pizza, Panic Emoji, Brendan Hines, Doc Reitzel, Philip Moss, Rulo's Bar, Jameson Saltzman, A Very Throwable Brick, Bitcoin Wallet Inspector, Shockfist, Weedlord, AI Scare, Backups Care, and of course, Computer Scare. I'm Nima Shirazi.
I'm Adam Johnson.
Citations Needed senior producer is Florence Burrow Adams. Our producer is Julianne Tweet, and production assistant is Trenda Lightburn. The newsletter is by Marco Cardellano. Transcriptions are by Machnor Imran. The music is by Granddaddy. Thanks again, everyone. We'll catch you next time.